So I'm going to be going over two examples that demonstrate how I would use the debugging process that I previously explained when I'm actually debugging code. This first example is going to be in the Eclipse IDE, and I'm going to be using the Java programming language. And my next example is going to be just in Notepad++, enhanced text editor, and I'll be using the command line to test it, and there I'll be using the Python programming language. This one is going to be targeted towards more simple things, more simple errors that might occur, and this is something that I'd consider representative of a programming project that might be assigned to an introductory programming student. Let's say you're in an intro to programming course, or if you're in high school and you're taking computer science A, this might be a type of assignment that you'd see. So let's get started. Here I'm just going to go over the code really quick, show you how it works, and tell you what it does. Basically, what I'm trying to do is get 10 numbers from a user. By a user, I mean whoever's using the program entering input into the command line terminal. And after I obtain those 10 numbers, I can either choose to print out the sum or the average. And if I tell it to print out the sum, it'll print out the sum. If I tell it to print out the average, then it'll print out the average of the 10 numbers that I entered. And if I write some other bogus value, then it'll just tell me that, well, that's not one of the options. You have to either choose sum or average. So let's go through the code really quickly. It's just two classes. In the tester class here, you'll notice I have my main methods. So this is where the code that's going to actually be executed is. And the first thing I do is I create a new instance of the calculator class. So the calculator class is over here. I already wrote it. And here I'm just creating a new instance of it. And then I'm calling calculator.calculate. So I'm calling the calculate method in the calculator class. Now, here in the calculator class, and if you're not very familiar with the Java programming language, or you use buffered reader instead of scanner, then don't worry about this. I'm using a scanner just to obtain user input, but if you don't understand it, I'm just going to go through it and explain it and take my word for it that it does indeed get the user input at that specific point in time. So in here within the calculator class, I have two private global variables. One is scanner, which is going to end up reading the user input. The other is a double called sum, and that's what I'm going to use to store the sum. And in the end, if I need to calculate the average, all I'm going to do is I'm going to divide that sum by 10. Because since there are 10 numbers to get the average, you take the total sum of all the numbers and you divide it by the amount of numbers, which in this case is 10. So in our constructor, which you'll notice the first thing that's called here is the constructor because we're creating a new instance of the class. In our constructor, all I'm doing is setting scanner equal to new scanner and passing in system.in as a parameter. This is how you set up the scanner so it can read input from a user. So don't worry about that too much. And then in the calculate method, notice that that's the next thing that's called here, the calculate method. Within the calculate method, the first thing I do is I loop through, oh, and by the way, let me say really quickly that I am going to play dumb in this example and pretend not to spot errors just so that you would see the process that you'd have to use to figure out where the error is occurring if you didn't see it right off the bat. But yes, there are going to be some errors here and you'll probably notice them as I'm going through. So back to the calculate method. The first thing that the calculate method does is it asks the user to enter a number, and it does that 10 times. And once it asks the user to enter a number, it'll store that number that the user enters to a variable called next that is of type double, and it will add that next variable to the total sum. Once all the numbers are added to the sum, so our sum actually has the total of all 10 numbers, and we'll jump out of this for loop and ask the user what they want us to calculate. From there, we'll get the result from the user and store it into a string called result. And then if the result is sum, then we're going to print the sum. So if the user entered sum, then we're going to print the sum of those 10 numbers. If the result is average, we're going to print the average of those 10 numbers. Otherwise, we're just going to print, I don't know how to calculate that if they enter some bogus value. So let's give it a run, see what we get. I'll bring up my console window here. So you see we have enter a number. I'm just going to do the numbers 1 through 10 here, or 1 through 9, I guess. And you'll notice that I tried to get the sum, but it said I don't know how to calculate that. However, sum is one of our options. So clearly there's an error here. And this is a semantic error. The reason for that being that even though we didn't get any sort of exception, the program still exited successfully. It did not give us our intended result. So looking at my steps for what to do if you get a semantic error, you'll see that the first thing I put is check the control flow. You have to know exactly what portions of code are being executed. So if we look here, I'm just going to concentrate on this calculate method here. We look here, this is what's supposed to be executed is first this part, right? Everything in the for loop. Then it's supposed to print this. And then it's supposed to go here in this part of the conditional and print out the sum. Now, it seems that because this was printed out instead, it seems that it's going here, but then jumping here, and instead of going into this block of the conditional, it goes to this block of the conditional. And so if I wasn't sure about that, like let's say I had a different program in which I wasn't printing this, I was just maybe exiting or printing nothing, then I could always check that with a system.out.println statement. And I'll just show you how I do that. Let's say I put Fluffy here, and then I want to see which branch of the conditional it's going into. So here I'll put, let's say, kittens. Here I'll put puppies, and here I'll put bunnies. So now what we want the program to do when we type in sum is we want it to say Fluffy and then kittens, because we're going into this part, this block. However, what's probably going to happen, because we printed this, remember, that's going to go into this block instead, and it'll say Fluffy bunnies. So we can always test that. And I'll just do that really quick, just for the sake of showing you. And you'll notice it printed Fluffy bunnies when we really wanted to print Fluffy kittens. However, we could kind of figure that out because we did actually print this here, so we knew it must have gone in this block of the conditional. So then, once we know that, once we know the control flow here, you could also check it if you wanted to. You could check it and make sure it's actually executing this part of the code too, and make sure it's here as well. If you wanted to put print statements everywhere, you could, but I think that's irrelevant here. You can pretty much tell that this is being executed because they asked us to enter a number, and the only difference is between what we wanted to happen and what did happen is that it jumped over here instead of going over here. So step 2 is to determine, well, I put print significant variables, but first you got to determine what those significant variables are. So let's determine the significant variables. What are the variables that are actually affecting our outcome? So if you notice, we went into this branch of the conditional instead of this one, right? So clearly, something must have been wrong with the condition that caused us to jump into this branch instead of this one. So if we look at our condition, this is the line at which I'd consider the error, quote unquote, to be occurring. And so look at this. Sum is a constant value, so there can't be anything wrong with that. Let's print out result. Let's consider that our significant variable. And so what I'm going to do is right before we make that jump, I'm just going to print out the value of result. And if I didn't actually want to go into the for loop, I could always add an exit statement here. I think I have to put 0 in there in Java. It might be system.exit. I don't even remember. Yeah, system.exit. But it doesn't really matter because the program's going to terminate here anyway, so it doesn't make a big difference. So let's run that. Oh, and notice, I probably should have mentioned this, but notice that I'm entering the same input every time so that I replicate the error under the same conditions. Because if I enter a different input and it works, well, then I don't know whether that's because I applied the correct fixes or whether that's just because I put different input into the program. But notice that we did print out, before we print out, I don't know how to calculate that, we did print out sum. So it is indeed reading sum correctly. So this variable is actually correct. So that tells us that it's not a problem with the variable itself. It has to be a problem with this statement somewhere. And if at this point, if you didn't know what the problem is, then I'd go look it up. How do you compare two strings and see if they're equal? But in this case, I can tell you that the problem is that I used the two equal signs instead of the dot equals method. And I know that might seem, that's annoying. That might seem like a really basic mistake, but I mean, I've been programming for years and I still do that on accident all the time, especially when I'm going from Python to Java, because in Python, that's not something you really have to worry about. So once I've applied that fix, I can test it again and see what we get. Enter number 1, 2, 3. So better. Now you'll notice that we did jump here and did indeed print out the sum instead of jumping here. So that's good.